Damon Fordham, author, historian, lecturer, and adjunct professor of history at Charleston Southern University in Charleston, South Carolina. You know, it's a common thing in my classes when I start talking about African American history, especially when I start talking about people such as the great Frederick Douglass and David Walker and Denmark Vesey and other of these great literate African Americans during the slave period. Inevitably, one of my students will tell me, "Gee, Mr. Fordham, I didn't know they had black people that were educated in slavery days." You know, perhaps I shouldn't be surprised about that, because unfortunately most people get their history from movies and television, and even worse, a lot of garbage that uninformed people put out on social media, and I hate to say it, in many cases, YouTube too. You always got to check people's sources before you believe these type of things. But anyway, with that being said, I often have to correct them that yes, you did have a lot of educated black people even during the slave era. In fact, I'm about to tell you about one of them now. One of them was a teacher during the slave era by the name of Daniel Alexander Payne. He was born in Charleston, South Carolina on February the 24th, 1811 to London and Martha Payne. Both of them were free blacks who were racially mixed. But his parents died young. But he still managed to learn to love reading and knowledge at an early age. There was a free black man by the name of Thomas Bonno who established a school. And he learned from that, but after he got the fundamentals of reading and writing, he went on to teach himself to master such subjects as Greek, Latin, mathematics, science, and classical literature. He was especially proud of learning Hebrew, ancient Greek on his own, so that he could read the Bible in its original languages. For those of you who don't know, the Old Testament was written in Hebrew and the New Testament was written in ancient Greek. Anyway, when Payne joined the Methodist Church at the age of 15, he said he heard the voice of God calling him, saying, "I have set thee apart to educate thyself, in order that thou mayest be an educator to thy people." So Payne would spend the rest of his life obeying that injunction. He described his early efforts in his autobiography entitled Reflections on 70 Years. He said, "My first school was opened in 1829 on a house in Tradd Street, which is in downtown Charleston, occupied by one Caesar Wright, and consisted of his 3 children, for each of whom he paid 50 cents a month. I also taught 3 adult slaves at night. This was not efficient to feed me, but a slave woman by the name of Eleanor Parker supplied many of my wants. I was happy in my humble employment, but at the end of the year, I was so discouraged by the financial result and by the remarks expressed by envious persons, note, by the remarks of envious persons, that I decided to seek some other employment which would yield better pay." However, he had an encounter with a slaveholder after considering this idea, and he was conversing with the slaveholder, and the slaveholder said, "Payne, do you know the difference between the master and a slave?" And Daniel Alexander Payne said he wasn't sure, and the slaveholder replied, get this, "Nothing but superior knowledge." Think about that. The difference between a slave and a free man, he said, was nothing but superior knowledge. And that reminded Daniel Alexander Payne of his duty to educate his brethren regardless of the low pay and the jealousy of other people. And he reopened his school. The second school expanded to a larger building that contained 60 students, among the enslaved as well as free black children as well as adults. However, by 1835, the school was in jeopardy. You see, back in the 1820s and 1830s, you had these literate, free and enslaved rebels such as Nat Turner and David Walker and Charleston's own Denmark Vesey. And they used biblical verses and newspaper stories about slave rebellions in Haiti and other places to encourage their slave brethren to revolt against slavery. And since these rebels used written materials and their ability to read and write to encourage these slave rebellions, the South Carolina legislature that year passed a law prohibiting the teachings of African Americans, free or slave, to read or write. So Payne was forced to close his school. But he moved to Philadelphia, where he rose in the ranks of the newly established African Methodist Episcopal Church, the AMEs, which was also outlawed in Charleston after the Denmark-Vesey Rebellion. So he became a bishop in the AME Church. He never forgot his conversation with the slaveholder and promoted education as a means of freedom for his people. And that occasionally caused controversy, because he was opposed to allowing illiterate preachers and the emotionless, unstructured style of religion that was popular among Southern blacks. In other words, he didn't go for all of that, well, I woke up this morning, then I was feeling bad, then now I know Jesus, then now I was glad, and all that kind of thing. You know, he wanted preachers who could educate the people as well as excite their emotions. So he brought order and structure to many of the AME churches. But that led to conflict with supporters of the old way of doing things. But he didn't let that stop him. He was one of the founders and the first president of Wilberforce University in Ohio, one of the first black colleges. And it was the first black college that actually was founded mostly by African Americans themselves, and it's still going on. He would also visit jails in many cities to minister to black prisoners. Now, while he felt that education was the key to freedom, he also understood that other means were necessary. In 1882, he was on a train to a church conference in Jacksonville, Florida, and the conductor attempted to force Bishop Payne into a railroad car for colored passengers. And Bishop Payne replied, I will not dishonor my manhood by going into that car. You stop your train and put me off. Well, the conductor did just that. And so Payne walked toward Jacksonville until some black men gave him a ride about a mile outside of the city. Protests were made to the authorities, and a newspaper editor and a district attorney refused to take Payne's case. But the editor and the district attorney both died of natural causes shortly afterward, and Bishop Daniel Alexander Payne was given complimentary tickets for future use on that train. So he died in 1893 at the age of 82. And I want you to think about this. A lot of you right now are teaching school, probably under very rough conditions with poor conditions, unruly students, parents who won't cooperate, wanting to come to school and fight the teacher and all of that. And sometimes you have to spend money out of your own pockets to educate these young people. Now, I just want you to think about this. With the difficulties that you face today, imagine what people like Bishop Daniel Alexander Payne went through to educate people at a time when it was far, far worse. And he went on to help start a college that exists today and create a legacy for the African American Episcopal Church, as well for the United States of America. So while you think you have it bad, think of how you have it. Think of how he had it then, and what you can do with your advantages today. This is Damon Fordham.